Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Brooke Logan didn't call the exigency family meeting smoothly, and everyone who entered that critical communication felt it incontinently in their gut. Brooke was numerous effects, emotional, impulsive at times, fiercely pious, but when she used the words exigency and family in the same judgment, it meant commodity was truly wrong. This wasn't about another Forrester Creations power struggle or a petty argument between Ridge and Steffi. This was bigger, heavier, and far more particular. By the time everyone gathered in the living room at the Forrester estate, the air itself felt tight, as though the walls had absorbed decades of secrets and were about to release them all at formerly. The family came in swells. Ridge arrived first, tense and guarded, formerly bracing for impact. He knew Brooke too well not to smell that she was carrying commodity that had been eating at her. Steffi followed, composed on the face but visibly bothered, easily wondering why she had been pulled down from her liabilities for commodity Brooke supposed critical. Hope arrived still, eyes searching her mama's face for consolation that no way came. Eric sat down sluggishly, his expression thoughtful and cautious, understanding that family meetings infrequently ended fairly. Indeed, those who hadn't wanted to come couldn't ignore the weight of the moment. This wasn't voluntary, Brooke had claimed. Brooke stood at the center of the room, hands clasped tightly, breathing shallow. She looked at each of them as if learning their faces, as if she demanded to remind herself why she was about to do what she was about to do. This wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest effects she'd ever faced, and that was saying commodity, considering her long, messy, passionate history with this family. But commodity had shifted inside her lately. A verity she could no longer bury. A consummation that silence was no longer guarding anyone. It was hurting them. The reason Brooke called the meeting wasn't a single event but a chain of moments that had been still erecting. Strange exchanges. Pieces of information that didn't relatively fit. Moping aesthetics and implied fears that followed her from room to room. Brooke had tried to tell herself she was overthinking, that her instincts were colored by once trauma and old injuries. But Brooke Logan had learned the hard way that ignoring her instincts generally led to disaster. And this time the cost of staying quiet felt too high. She began by reminding them why they were each there, because family signified indeed when it was complicated, indeed when it hurt. She spoke about how secrets had torn them piecemeal over the times, how lies, indeed well-intentioned bones, had destroyed trust and rewritten connections ever. As she spoke, the room grew heavier. Everyone knew she wasn't speaking in general terms. This wasn't a lecture. This was a warning. Also, Brooke said the words that made everything stop. She admitted that commodity had been hidden from the family, commodity involving further than one generation, commodity that had been still shaping recent events in ways none of them completely understood. She didn't reveal everything at formerly. Brooke no way did. She let the verity unfold sluggishly, each piece wharf like a weight on the casket. She spoke about opinions made out of fear. About choices made to cover people who maybe didn't want to be defended presently. About how love, when mixed with control and secretiveness, could come commodity dangerous. Ridge's expression changed first. The guard faded, replaced by confusion and also unbelief. He asked questions Brooke wasn't completely set to answer out loud, because saying them meant making them real. Steffi crossed her arms, her tolerance thinning. Formerly induced that this was another attempt to stir chaos under the guise of honesty. Hope still looked devastated, not angry, not protective, just deeply hurt. She tasted that whatever Brooke was about to completely reveal would change the way she saw her family ever. Brooke eventually admitted that she had known further than she let on about recent events, about provocations, about conduct that had been explained down as misconstructions or bad timing. She confessed that she stayed quiet because she believed effects would resolve themselves, because she hoped the verity wouldn't be as damaging as it appeared. But stopgap, Brooke realized, was no longer enough. Silence had allowed resentment to grow. It had allowed people to feel manipulated, dismissed, and betrayed. Eric spoke also, his voice calm but heavy with disappointment. He reminded everyone that this family had survived dishonors, backstabbings, and dolor before, but only when the verity ultimately came out. He made it clear that whatever Brooke was holding back demanded to be said now, Not hereafter, not latterly. The meeting had formerly crossed a line. There was no going back. That was when Brooke revealed the core of it, the verity that forced her to call everyone together. She explained that recent conflicts weren't accidental, that certain opinions were told by information that had been designedly withheld, that someone in the family had been operating under a false narrative, believing they were acting in everyone's stylish interest, while intentionally causing deep detriment. Brooke didn't name the person outright at first, but the recrimination was clear enough to shoot shockwaves through the room. Steffi's countenance cracked. She demanded clarity, refusing to sit through vague allegations. Ridge looked torn, caught between fidelity and the growing consummation that Brooke wasn't exaggerating. Hope's eyes filled with gashes as the emotional counter-accusations began to sink by. This wasn't about business. This wasn't indeed about love. This was about trust, and the damage done when that trust was manipulated behind unrestricted doors. When Brooke eventually said the name, the room went silent. The response wasn't explosive at first. It was stupefied. Unbelief hung in the air as everyone reused the possibility that someone they loved, someone they reckoned on, had been making opinions for them without concurrence. Brooke made it clear that she wasn't trying to destroy anyone. This wasn't vengeance. This was responsibility. She said she could no longer watch her family fracture under the weight of half-trueness and precisely constructed falsehoods. What followed wasn't crying, it was commodity worse. Quiet wrathfulness. Shattered hypotheticals. Connections being mentally reevaluated in real time. Steffi felt betrayed not just by the disclosure but by Brooke herself, furious that she had awaited this long. Ridge plotted with guilt, wondering how much he'd ignored because it was easier than asking delicate questions. Hope felt torn between understanding her mama's fear and begrudging her silence. By the end of the meeting, nothing was resolved, but everything had changed. Brooke didn't walk down feeling relieved. She felt exposed, drained, and sorrowfully apprehensive that honesty doesn't heal incontinently. Occasionally it just opens the crack so it can no longer be ignored. As the family sluggishly dispersed, the emotional fallout dallied in every corner of the room. Trust had been damaged. Commitment were questioned. And the consequences of Brooke's decision were only just beginning. After the family meeting ended, the house didn't return to normal. It couldn't. The Forrester estate had always carried the echoes of once competitions, but this time, the silence felt heavier, more endless. People didn't slam doors or storm out. They left sluggishly, designedly, as if each step needed trouble. Brooke stayed before long after the room voided, standing exactly where she had been when everything unraveled. She told herself she'd done the right thing, but the verity was far messier. Doing the right thing didn't feel victorious. Felt lonely. Word spread snappily, as it always did in this family. Within hours, the meeting came further than a private reckoning, it came a fracture line. Everyone interpreted Brooke's disclosure else, filtering it through times of resentment, fidelity, and emotional scar towel. Some saw courage. Others saw manipulation disguised as honesty. And a many-aphorism commodity indeed more dangerous, a woman eventually choosing control after times of being controlled by the consequences of other people's opinions. Ridge couldn't escape the weight of it. He replayed the meeting over and over, realizing how numerous warning signs he'd ignored, because they didn't fit the interpretation of reality he preferred. He'd spent times criminating Brooke of seeing problems where none was, of overreacting, of letting emotion override sense. And yet then he was forced to admit that she had seen commodity he hadn't, or hadn't wanted to. The consummation bruised his pride, but worse, it cracked his confidence in his own judgment. Steffi's response was colder, more advised. She didn't collapse under the verity, she compartmented it. To her, Brooke's timing signified as important as the verity itself. Why now? Why during a period when the family was formerly stretched thin? Steffi induced herself that the meeting was lower about translucency and further about influence. Indeed, if the verity was real, she questioned the motive behind revealing it this way. In Steffi's mind, intentions signified. And Brooke's intentions, she believed, were no way as pure as Brooke claimed. Hope, on the other hand, unraveled still. She had erected her adult life on the idea that she could do better than the generation before her. That honesty, empathy, and openness could cover her from repeating their miscalculations. The meeting shattered that illusion, however. The woman who sermonized verity and responsibility could stay silent for so long if her own mama. She was disoriented. The moral compass she trusted had suddenly spun out of alignment. Eric watched all of this with the heavy tolerance of someone who had seen too important history reprise itself. He honored the pattern secrets revealed too late, trust broken too deeply, justifications offered long after damage had been done. He understood Brooke's fear, indeed sympathized with it, but he also knew commodity she didn't want to admit. Verity delayed frequently becomes verity weaponized. And now, the family would have to deal not only with the verity itself but with the resentment girding its timing. Meanwhile, the person at the center of Brooke's disclosure felt the walls closing in. For them, the meeting wasn't just an exposure, it was an identity extremity. They had believed their conduct were justified, indeed necessary. They told themselves that withholding information was an act of protection, not manipulation. Hearing Brooke frame it else forced them to defy an uncomfortable possibility that they had crossed a line without realizing it, or worse, without minding. That internal conflict didn't lead to immediate guilt. It led to guard, to vindication, to incense. Being exposed didn't inspire responsibility, it burned fear. And fear, in this family, had a way of raising into retribution. As days passed, the ripple goods grew stronger. Old alliances began to shift. Exchanges stopped mid-sentence when certain people entered the room. Every commerce carried an turnabout of dubitation. Indeed, moments meant to be neutral, business meetings, casual checksways, participated refections felt charged. No bone knew who to trust completely presently, and that query came sharp. Brooke felt the insulation most acutely. People still spoke to her, but the warmth was gone. There was a distance in their eyes, a vacillation before they responded. She had anticipated wrathfulness from some, gratefulness from others, but she hadn't anticipated the emotional limbo she now enthralled. She wasn't the villain, but she wasn't the idol moreover. She was simply the person who lit the match. At night, mistrustfulness crept by. Brooke questioned every step that led her to that meeting. She wondered if there had been another way, one that didn't leave similar visible wreckage before. But deep down, she knew that the family had been standing on unstable ground long before she spoke. She hadn't created the fault line. She had just exposed it. Ridge ultimately brazened the reality he'd been avoiding. The family couldn't move forward without defying the fate directly. Pretending effects would settle on their own was no longer an option. The damage was too visible. Connections were formerly shifting, hardening, reshaping themselves around the verity. Ignoring it would only consolidate the peak. Steffi, seeing the shift in power dynamics, began situating herself precisely. She didn't attack Brooke outright. Rather, she concentrated on stability, on buttressing the idea that the family demanded leadership, clarity, and boundaries. To her, Brooke's emotional honesty had created chaos, and chaos needed control. Whether she admitted it or not, Steffi saw an occasion to assert influence under the guise of protection. Hope plotted with a different battle. She wanted to believe that honesty could still lead to mending, but every attempt to talk effects through sounded to make the injuries soak more sprucely. She set up herself questioning not just her mama, but everyone around her. Who differently was holding back? What differently was being decided for her without her knowledge? The meeting had awakened a sense of vulnerability she hadn't felt in times. The person exposed by Brooke's disclosure faced adding pressure. Their apologies grew thinner as further details surfaced, as further people compared notes and realized how important they hadn't known. What once sounded like insulated opinions now formed a pattern, one that suggested control rather than care. The family didn't defy them all at formerly. That would have been too dramatic, too egregious. Rather, the judgment came still, in the form of changed jest and withdrawn trust. That quiet judgment was harder to endure than open wrathfulness. As the weeks unfolded, it came clear that Brooke's exigency meeting wasn't a single event. It was a turning point. Connections that had survived affairs, backstabbings, and power struggles now faced commodity further insidious mistrustfulness. Mistrustfulness about intentions. Mistrustfulness about motives. Mistrustfulness about whether love had ever truly been unconditional, or if it had always been shaped by retired dockets. Brooke watched it all with a blend of remorse and resoluteness. She didn't apologize for telling the verity, but she did suffer the cost. She understood now that honesty doesn't form damage, it reveals it. What comes next depends on whether people are willing to sit with discomfort rather of running from it. As the pressure continued to settle over the family like an imperturbable fog, commodity subtle but dangerous began to be people stopped being honest with themselves. The exigency meeting had forced everyone to defy a verity they hadn't asked for, but it hadn't given them the tools to deal with it. Rather, they retreated into familiar survival patterns. Some chose control. Others chose denial. And many chose emotional pullout, believing distance was safer than battle. Brooke felt that pullout every time she walked into a room. Exchanges would break, eyes would flutter down, and polite grins replaced genuine connection. It wasn't hostility, it was query. People didn't know where to place her presently. She was no longer just the emotional center of the family, or the woman whose heart always led her. She had come the disruptor, the bone, who had forced a reckoning no bone felt set for. That marker cleaved to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. What hurt most was the silence from the people she allowed would understand her artificially. The bones, who had served from verity in the history, now sounded reluctant to admit it. Brooke realized also that people don't always want honesty. They want comfort. And comfort had been stripped down the moment she spoke. Ridge tried to be the ground, but indeed he plotted to hold both sides. He wanted to believe that time would smooth the edges, that feelings would cool and clarity would return. Yet every attempt to homogenize the situation only emphasized how shattered effects truly were. The family didn't need normality, they demanded resolution. And resolution needed responsibility. Commodity no bone was completely ready to offer or accept. Steffi's influence continued to grow in the fate, not because she demanded it, but because people gravitated toward certainty. She spoke in absolutes about boundaries, about leadership, about guarding the family from farther insecurity. To some, her clarity felt reassuring. To others, it felt like a quiet connection of power. Either way, her voice carried weight now, especially as Brooke's emotional authority waned. Hope, caught between those two forces, began to question her own identity within the family. She had always defined herself in discrepancy to the chaos that girdled her, believing she could choose a different path. But the meeting shattered that vision. She realized that no matter how precisely she lived, she was still affected by choices made long before she had any say-so. That consummation bred a kind of sadness that didn't explode, it settled. The person at the center of Brooke's disclosure continued to repel the counter-accusations of what had been exposed. Rather than stepping forward with guilt, they framed themselves as Ms. New. They refocused to intentions rather of issues, to love rather of impact. But the family's tolerance weakened as patterns came clearer. Defenses that formerly passed unnoticed now felt concave. Trust, formerly cracked, proved delicate to repair. What made the situation more unpredictable was the absence of a clear villain. This wasn't a story of good versus evil. It was a story of fear, control, and the mortal tendency to justify dangerous jest. When it's wrapped in affection, that nebulosity made remission harder. It's easier to forgive atrocity than it's to forgive manipulation disguised as care. Brooke plotted with that distinction herself. She knew she had delayed the verity out of fear. Fear of losing people she loved, fear of destabilizing a fragile peace. But watching the consequences unfold forced her to accept another verity by staying. She had come complicit. That consummation counted on her more heavily than any wrathfulness directed at her by others. Late at night, Brooke replayed moments she wished she could undo. Not the meeting itself, but the months of silence that anteceded it. She wondered how numerous openings for honesty she had let slip by. How numerous times she had chosen temporary harmony over long-term integrity. Those questions visited her, not because they had easy answers but because they didn't. Eric, observing the ongoing pressure, honored that the family was approaching a crossroads. They could either defy the deeper issues exposed by the meeting, or they could fracture further, each person retreating into their own interpretation of the verity. He knew that this family had survived worse, but survival wasn't the same as mending. Without deliberate trouble, old injuries would calcify into endless divisions. The longer the fate stretched on, the clearer it came that Brooke's exigency meeting wasn't about a single secret. It was about a culture of silence that had been passed down through generations. Opinions made behind unrestricted doors. Trueness softened or withheld to save power. Love expressed through control rather than trust. Those patterns didn't belong to one person. They belonged to the family itself. And that was the most uncomfortable consummation of all. As pressures coddled, small competitions began to surface. Not explosive but telling. People started asserting boundaries they had preliminarily ignored. Others withdrew entirely, choosing emotional tone preservation over engagement. The family dynamic shifted from connected to conservative. Each relationship reasoned under the shadow of what had been revealed. Brooke tasted that the coming phase wouldn't be about justifications or explanations. It would be about choices. Who was willing to change? Who was willing to hear? And who would cleave to old habits? Indeed, if it meant losing the people they claimed to cover.